was a wonderful introduction, and I thank you so much. And we did meet this past year in Kentucky at something that I didn't even know existed called the Kentucky Academy of Sciences, even though I spent my whole life there. And we wound up in Richmond, Kentucky in the same symposium, and I think established a real bond in terms of how we perceive global health, even though we are so different in the way we go about doing our global health. So it is really an honor to be here and to be invited to this series. I've seen a number of the people, and I've heard some of those people who've spoken here before, so it's quite an illustrious group, and I do thank you. And there's not too many people I would have given up the NCAA for, but the game isn't until 9 o'clock, so it's all right. Anyway, I would like just for a few moments to know something more about you all. And after we do that, I want to go through a series of PowerPoints relatively quickly, and then I would like to go through some photographs and introduce you to some of the people who've helped shape my worldview. But obviously you're here either because an instructor is telling you you have to be, or because you have an interest in global health or in vulnerable populations or whatever. So how many of you have worked in some capacity outside the United States? A number of you. And of those of you who've done that, how many would say you have worked in settings that are very resource limited, either because they're very rural, they're remote, or because they're just intense needs among the populations? Okay, so still a number of you. And how many of you have done that but within the United States? Well, that's important, and it's really important to me because I think often we forget that our country, our states, our communities are part of the globe. And so when we talk about global health, a lot of the time we do automatically in our minds go to another country, across a border, or across someplace. But many of the things that I have found to be true in dealing with populations, particularly very vulnerable populations, is just as true here as it may be there. So there's a lot of topics that can get covered when you're discussing global health. And I decided I would just go ahead and select focusing for a little bit on displaced people, not because it is the most urgent crisis in the world, but it is one of them. And when you consider how migration of peoples has shaped where we are today, and you consider how much migration, forced or voluntary, is happening now, it begins to have more meaning, I think, in terms of how it affects everybody. So if we think about displaced people, and in our initiative in Nashville and Vanderbilt, we consider displaced people to be those who are refugees and immigrants, those who are internally displaced, which we're going to talk a lot about, those who are trafficked, those who may find themselves, even in our own environment, homeless or without a space and a place that they feel a connection to. Globally, at any given time, there are 35 to 40 million people who are displaced, and sometimes in some years it goes up to 45 million. Most are displaced within their own country. The refugee population is usually found in a space of large space, but between Southwest Asia, through the Middle East, and into the Great Lakes and the central regions of Africa, and most of the internally displaced people are there as well. This is very text heavy, but I wanted to just make sure that for anyone who wasn't thinking about different classifications, that we do recognize there's a real set of circumstances that apply to each of these groups. Refugees have to go across an international border to be classified a refugee, even though we use that term loosely. And they have to get the classification by the United Nations, prove that there is a well-founded fear And that may be of persecution because of their nationality, their ethnicity, their religion, or whatever. But that well-founded fear is the pillar that underlies refugees. Asylum seekers, we have many asylum seekers in different countries, very often because they may be in a country when something happens in their host country and they cannot get back, and they are allowed to stay. At Vanderbilt, in the Iranian hostage crisis, we had a lot of students at that time from Iran, and they couldn't get back, and all of them became asylum seekers. That's one example. IDPs, we're going to spend a good bit of time talking about, but again, these are people within their own country. They have not crossed a border. They are still subjects of their own government, even though the government may be the cause of why they had to flee. And then, of course, immigrants, and in any given year, there's probably close to 1 million immigrants who come legally into this country and have for many decades. The undocumented, which gets so much attention now, are people without their papers, obviously. Stateless persons are less familiar to us, but they are people in this ambiguous, and even the literature will tell you it's a very, very ambiguous term, but basically they're people without passports, without nationalities, and without a government. The trafficked persons are either labor or sexual, usually, and that's a huge and growing number, growing because of the internet in part. And we think about it in terms of internationally, but I know that many of you probably know how insidious this problem has become locally and regionally. In Tennessee, for example, we have 95 counties. In 2010, 85 of those 95 counties had a trafficking case, and those were not foreign girls. And some were boys or men, but most were girls, and most were Tennessee girls. I think the same is true for Georgia. The UN, however, in looking internationally, will look at both the labor and the sexual trafficking, and their estimate is pretty staggering, 700 to 2 million people. It is also a huge, huge profit for organized crime. So IDPs, we just spoke about having not crossed an international border, often being targeted by their own governments, but they still retain citizenship. And if anybody can get to them to help them with their human rights, they have them. Just because somebody is displaced within their own country does not mean that they aren't due international humanitarian law and human rights. Lots of pictures that you can see that demonstrate where displaced people live. If you think about how many internally displaced folks there were in 2011, there's too many statistics on here to read each of them, but there are millions. And of those millions, there are 3 primary countries. What would you say they are? Just anybody. Somalia. Okay. Another guess? Afghanistan. Okay. Now these are, right, all of those are great suggestions, and they are full of IDPs. But surprisingly, oops, the most displaced people are in Colombia. You knew it and didn't say it, okay. And that's because the violence in Colombia is just so massive. And often it is women and children who are fleeing violence from rebel groups in their own population. Iraq, you've already said. We'll spend a good bit of time on Iraq and South Sudan, which is pretty self-explanatory. So with these refugees who are fleeing due to their well-founded fear, there are categories that the UN gives them. You can read these for yourself. They obviously may have medical needs, they may have legal needs, they have been subjected to torture. Women right now are, for whatever reason, more than any time in history, being targeted, women and girls, and sexual assault is actually used as a strategy of war, and it seems that that's been increasing in prevalence since the Bosnian War, actually, which was the first time I had heard in my lifetime of rape being used as a strategy of war. Children and adolescents and elderly. For refugees, those who have the formal classification, there are three options. They may voluntarily repatriate, and that's the most desirable thing for somebody who has had to flee their country. They may be integrated locally, or they may be resettled into a third country, which is the least desirable, but for many, many refugees who don't feel that they can safely go back to their own country, they want to locate to a third country, mostly because of their children. And there are many, many examples of why someone desperately would like to go back to their country, but they feel that they cannot overcome the fear and that their children will not have the opportunity to really have a life, have a chance. Resettlement is always the business and the responsibility of a government. It is not, however, in most places in the world. The central government is often doing this. It's an NGO. It's an international organization of some sort that is helping with the resettlement, because so often it's the central government of that country that is creating the problem. Here's your Afghanistan and your Iraq. These are the major sources of refugees in the world at the end of 2010, and pretty much would still hold true right now in 2013. So that's the major source where refugees are originating from, and here's the major hosting countries. This can be misinterpreted. These are the countries that have the most refugees that have come into them from crossing the borders. This is not, however, reflective of what countries resettle those refugees permanently. Far and away the United States does, far and away, and many European countries do. Right after these. But these happen to be the ones that have refugees, and yet they will not resettle them and give them citizenship or permanent residency in the way that the U.S. will. Let's just talk for a few minutes about the Middle East. I have never been to the Middle East. As Dan just said, probably will be there about a month from now. And one reason that it's so important to us is because everything that was unstable before has become much more unstable. Iraq had a lot of people who fled Iraq. They fled into other countries. But now they're having to return to their own home, and a lot of them are in great danger returning to their own home because they worked with the U.S. military. The Syrian circumstance is creating havoc everywhere, and many Syrians are fleeing into northern Iraq, into the Kurdistan area. The KRG is the Kurdistan Regulation Army, and they have been reportedly extraordinarily open and gracious to hosting these refugees who are coming from all kinds of places. 15,000 in the one camp, and that's growing. So this civil war has created a reverse migration for the people who'd gone to Syria for safe haven, now are having to leave. And the entire Middle East has become a place where there really is no humanitarian space. So I'm just going to stop every now and then and throw out a question. Anybody know what we're talking about when we say humanitarian space? Anybody want to take a shot at what is humanitarian space? It's probably, I know a lot of you in here can take a great guess, but it's all right. It's an area that is really dwindling, and the non-government organizations that have long held to the need for humanitarian space are really, really at odds with a lot of governments, because they're saying that it should be free of any government interference, and it should be impartial and neutral groups providing aid to whomever is in that space, up to and including combatants. So the International Committee of Red Cross was founded on impartiality and neutrality. And even if there's a government that is causing a lot of atrocities or deaths or whatever, the International Red Cross will not denounce them, because it does not allow them then to go behind the lines, to look at prisoners of war, to find if civilians are being treated under the code of conduct. So you never find the International Committee of Red Cross denouncing any government. On the other hand, there are other NGOs, such as Doctors Without Borders, who rarely do it because it's not a safe thing to do, but on occasion who say, we have to speak out. In fact, the organization started in 1971 because of the war in Biafra and because the government was committing so many atrocities. The French doctors who started Doctors Without Borders worked with the International Committee of Red Cross, and they backed up and said, you have to denounce the government. ICRC said, we cannot. We've worked this way for 100 years. We cannot. And so these 5 doctors went back to Paris and started MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders. So it's a very, very complex, as you might imagine, situation, and in the Middle East particularly so. And it's getting even more complex because we don't necessarily think about the Israeli-Palestinian situation as a part of this, but it is, because many Palestinian refugees had fled to to Syria, and because they can no longer stay in Syria, now they're wanting to come into Jordan, and for Jordan, they're being overrun by refugees from every country, and it's a big political thing for them to decide that they're going to accept Palestinians. On the other hand, if they do not, there will be more who are killed. And you can see the number here, 1,130 as of the end of March had been killed. So forced displacement is happening in rather unprecedented ways all over the world, and most especially in Asia, in Africa, in certain countries we'll talk about in a moment, and certainly in the Middle East. And it's increasing. UNHCR, for anyone who might not be familiar with that, is the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees, and that is sort of the guru of undertaking all refugee situations in hand. If we look at Africa, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center is a primary group that monitors displacement around the world. And they were looking at the 21 sub-Saharan African countries, estimating almost 10 million displaced, which represents 1/3 of the world's displaced populations. And Sudan, DRC, and Somalia are the ones with the largest internally displaced populations. Another cause that's sort of increasing, it seems, and I think you just came back from a country that had firsthand experience with that, but elections are creating a lot of displacement now. Elections seemingly are becoming more violent, and I think Dr. Colley just returned from Côte d'Ivoire 2 days ago, and their upheaval was more than a year ago, and it's still displaced, yes, in terms of many, many people. South Sudan, we're going to talk about a lot just in a moment because it is such a vast problem. But there are a lot who have been displaced by the North-South war. There's even more who've been displaced now by elections in South Sudan. DRC, they've got the longest running civil war going, and it seems that hundreds of thousands continually are displaced. You can see that Kenya, and Nigeria also had displacement because of elections. And keep in mind with these countries, just like Jordan now accepting all of those, for those of you old enough to remember, you may remember when we had Vietnam going on, Thailand was getting refugees from Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. They still have some of those refugees, and now Myanmar refugees come in. So we may think that these countries should be totally open to accepting these really important lost people, but the resources within those countries are as strained as they can be. And sooner or later, they just say no, and they start pushing back, and sometimes they push back in really horrific ways. Sudan is the largest country in Africa, which most of you probably knew. It's at least 1/3 the size of the US. And the reason I put it in here is so that you could see that the size or the country shape for those who might not be familiar. Recognize that this civil war between the North and the South went on for a very long time, that now not just Darfur, which we hear a great deal about, but if you look at the fact that there's new conflict going on in the eastern part, I'm going to go back to that map. So the eastern part of South Sudan now has refugees going into Ethiopia. The western part has had displaced people for 7, 8, 9 years, and they're falling over into Chad. So these are going all kinds of ways, even though this North-South war is over. Ethiopia, I just cherry-picked this because I wanted to point out that it isn't always international organizations. A lot of these nations have started their own non-government organizations and are attending to refugees too. Darfur, which you've heard a lot about, George Clooney and lots of other celebrities have called attention to Darfur, is the size of France. I mean, it's hard for us to get our hands around or our heads around the fact that this area within Sudan is the size of France, but it's home to about 6 million people and 100 tribes. They remain, I think, probably some of the most vulnerable and a people who are suffering as much as any people on the globe, and I'll share some about that and my own experience in the Darfur camps. Chad has lots and lots of refugees coming in, among them these Darfurians. When they come in, they take a lot of resources. They use the firewood, they use the water, they use the things that the local people have to use. This is in the Sahel, and the desperate conditions that these people live in is almost indescribable. Some of you may have been in some of these areas, but what happens politically is that a country like Chad, and there are many others, will allow them to come in and will allow an international NGO to provide care for them in these sprawling camps, but they will not allow a Sudanese Darfurian, for example, to be paid. So if there's going to be any work, which there has to be in the camp, it has to be Chadian people who come in and provide this work. Now I'm giving you this as an example, but it's true in many, many countries, that these countries do not want wages to be paid to the refugees who come into their country. They want their own people to be paid, and that causes a lot of tension, as well as anything else that has to be negotiated and dealt with. And you can see the aridness of this area, and I'll tell you a little story when we get more into talking about this Darfur camp. But I want you to just look at those trees, and I want to tell you that a Japanese non-government organization came into this camp right here, and they thought it was so overwhelmingly sad, dry, arid, no water to speak of unless it was hauled in, and they planted a bunch of Japanese cherry trees. Now, I'm telling you that because in a few minutes I hope you will remind me to tell you about those Japanese cherry trees and ask you what you thought happened, because the local refugees in that camp said, get these trees out of here. So I want to ask you why you think that. This is the Doctors Without Borders ambulance in the camp. It's the local ambulance. There were land cruisers that could actually take people away, but that's the little logo that is a Doctors Without Borders logo, and it sufficed really well as an ambulance to go in and around these thatched roofed places where the refugees lived. This is somebody I'll share very carefully with you. She's an 84-year-old who lives in one of those places. And she had a huge and terrible tumor in her eye. She was blind, but she had extraordinary resilience. She had a wonderful sense of humor. She did not act as though she was living in a refugee camp and was blind. And she was cared for really lovingly by her daughters and her granddaughters, who said they did not want her to be sent off for this potential surgery that might have been able to remove this tumor. It wouldn't have given her eyesight back. But the reason they didn't want her to go was because they loved her so much, they were afraid that she wouldn't survive. So in the face of all this, there is a great deal of uplifting kinds of things. And these women, for example, they've been in the camp long enough to have regained their health, and they're there with their babies for well baby checks. And these folks are reading about themselves in National Geographic. This was the staff that worked with us in this camp, and of course they can't read the English, but they're looking at themselves in this National Geographic, and it was just an amazing experience for somebody to walk in with this magazine and hand it to them. So that sort of, in a very brief synopsis, talks about internally displaced persons, refugees, and just a snapshot of some of the complexities that you think about having to deal with when you're working with those populations. But there are other causes of displacement, and I just wanted to bring a couple of them up. Urbanization, and that's happening everywhere in the world, but it's particularly happening in places where there's conflict, or, interestingly, in places where there's good things happening, like better education. And better education means that young people don't want to stay in their rural and remote communities because there are no jobs. So they want to go to the city. So they go to the city, but then we have an awful lot of people in those cities and too few jobs. So that happens in this country, but it's certainly happening in the developing world a great deal. And others are fleeing conflict, and they wind up in the cities trying to be more safe, and then they never leave the cities. So the shape of how many of these countries live out their community life is dramatically different than even 10, 15, 20 years ago. I'll let you just read that and take a break from listening to me. So it isn't just conflict, but it's also natural disasters, because it's like Haiti post-earthquake. It's just too overwhelming to them to think about going back. They may have come into Port-au-Prince because they heard that they could get some kind of food, some kind of assistance, and once in Port-au-Prince, they never go back. So the urbanization is going to be, I think, a real challenge in the decades to come, because the cities are not set up to deal with these infrastructures. And some of the worst slums in the world, Kibera in Nairobi, the slum in Calcutta, we're going to have more cities with those kinds of slums. And it's going to be a really serious situation. Displacement, climate change, and natural disasters all create displacement. And again, when people leave, they sometimes don't go back. We see that in our own country, and we certainly see it in other places. And if you, depending on who you listen to and how you think about climate change, if in fact it is increasing, we're going to have massive displacement because of the rising seas and the diminishing land. So what happens when there is a natural disaster? Again, I'm just going to sort of pick a couple of places. You'll remember in 2004, December, the big tsunami happened, and it really engulfed all of Southeast Asia. And just in a few minutes, I'm going to show you some other slides with regard to that tsunami. But it's really interesting how the world responds. I can't remember what the next one is. Well, this is it. How the world responds to disasters. Because when the tsunami hit, there was an outpouring, and there were billions of dollars of aid that came in. 4 months after this, a very, very serious earthquake hit in Pakistan, and there was very little response. The world just didn't seem to want to respond to that, and maybe it was compassion fatigue, whatever it was. But what happened is that in this tsunami, there were very few survivors. If you remember, everybody was swept out to the sea. In the earthquakes, there are often survivors with very, very crushing, injurious injuries, and they need a lot of medical care. But all of the money that was being sent into the tsunami, people were trying to figure out how best to use that. And in Pakistan, where there was this terrible earthquake, there was no money to be distributed and to really give the medical care. The next slide is very graphic. It is not mine. It is a colleague of mine who went over to the tsunami. And the reason I left it in here, it's fairly graphic, but I think it's important to realize that when we have something like this, just as in a war, people have to go take care of it. And it isn't always internationals. It's the local people who have to take care of their own communities. It's the local people who have to take care of their own dead, sometimes in horrific sorts of ways, such as this. And they often are the ones who are never thought about in terms of being real important and real heroes in their own community, but they are. For a long time, we were talking about this today, they could not fish. This happens to be in Sri Lanka. They could not fish off these coasts because so many bodies had been carried out to sea that it was not safe to eat the fish for obvious reasons. When enough time had passed that it seemed like it was perhaps safe enough to begin eating fish, some of the fishermen wanted to go and begin doing it, and the other fishermen said, don't. That is a mistake. We can't do that. And if we do that, then the aid that is still coming in is going to start going away because they're going to think that we're back to normal. So what do y'all think about that? Do you think that those fishermen had a point?
Well, where would you start? If you don't start fishing, where's the first step where you start rebuilding? I mean, if you don't start, well, you're not going to get the aid. But at some point, you have to say, okay, you just get back to normal,
Exactly. You do. And so you do have to start, and we know that if we give too much aid, little, moderate, large amounts, and we aren't doing it responsibly, we actually will foster dependency. We know that. But the problem with this is that he's right. In terms of donations to this kind of thing, they do stop. And with the tsunami, it wasn't quite as serious as it is with other things because so much money had been given. But behind that scene, with these fishermen looking out at the scene you're looking at, let's say it's all clear water now and they want to go out, but behind them are still completely devastated schools, hospitals, streets, roads, etc. So they can start fishing, but there's no way that they're going to rebuild their infrastructure without assistance. And that's why it is so complex to try and figure out that magic type of formula, if you will, of how to render aid and at the same time build self-sufficiency. So going forward, there's sort of a bleak, at this moment, thought about the fact that climate change, natural disasters will continue, that displacement will continue because of conflict. And the person who was quoted below, I think, hit it. Global displacement is an inherently international problem and as such needs international solutions, and by this I mean mainly political solutions. And I think that that is really important to remember, that you can provide aid and you can have faith-based, secular, government, non-government organizations, but sooner or later people are going to have to deal with the politics of what's creating some of these circumstances. So even though the world still keeps most of its own and they don't migrate, in any given year, 60 to 80,000 in the past decade have come into the U.S. That's refugees, only refugees. And then in any given year, and it may fluctuate for a long time, we've had nearly 1 million immigrants who have come in. And they come into the U.S. and they fluctuate, and you see where it dipped certainly after 9/11, and then it went back up. Then it dipped again because of some conflict about screening and how we were screening refugees. And most who we are receiving in the U.S. now have for the past 3 to 4 years come from 3 primary countries. That's Burma, Bhutan, and Iraq, Burma being, of course, Myanmar. We had 75,000 in 2009, and it dropped down to 56,000 in 2011, 2012 because of the screening deal going on. It will go back up into the 70,000s. And a lot of them come to Atlanta. Does anybody work with refugees or immigrants in Georgia? I think most come to Atlanta, just like most come to Nashville and Tennessee. But The Eritreans? What? Okay. Other groups? The Kurds. Well, it'd be interesting to see how many Kurds you have. Supposedly, the largest Kurdish population in the U.S. went to Nashville, and I think that's because of secondary migration, not primary. Here's one of the things to consider, though, that I think is a flashpoint for a lot of people, because there is a real push now for us to lessen the number of refugees who come in. And we have taken refugees forever. We need to still continue to take refugees, but it is true that with the recession and everything that has gone on the last 6 years, that a lot of them are falling into debt, and it's very hard for them to climb out. And I don't know how many of you know this, it may be common knowledge, but refugees don't come into this country debt-free. They hit the ground, and they immediately have to start working within supposedly 90 days. And one reason it's so important for them to get a job is they have to pay their airfare back to the US government. And if they happen to come in with a large family, they're in huge debt before they even get off the ground. But the vast majority are not ever going to come. They're not going to relocate. They're going to stay in one of these kinds of places, or they're going to resettle into their original village. So what I want to do just for a moment is to run through these slides. The ones that you just saw, some of them were mine, some of them were my colleagues, as I told you, and some of them were ICRC's. These, for the most part, are mine, and so I just thought, well, I'm supposed to be talking about perspectives from one American nurse, and I'll give you one perspective. This is an ICRC slide, but if you aren't familiar with the history of humanitarian aid, it's pretty fascinating history if you have any interest in that topic. Until the 1880s, it was usually the church that attended to sick, poor, wounded, whatever. And in 1880 something, Henri Dunant, a Swiss businessman, went off to a business trip to Italy, and he went right into, not in battle with it, but saw the aftermath of this horrific carnage that came out of the Battle of Solferino. And he was so horrified by seeing all of these people dying on the battlefield and no one there to care for them, he went back to Geneva and he started what has become the International Committee of Red Cross. Almost, some years before that, Clara Barton was traipsing around the battlefields here and wound up doing the same thing, which then became the American Red Cross. And through those decades, it has been quite something how these international Red Cross agencies and different groups sprung up, like the International Rescue Committee out of New York, started in the 30s. Some of them have been going on for quite a while, but it was only after World War II that we really had a serious focus on what do we do in terms of rendering humanitarian aid. And the Code of Conduct of War, which I mentioned earlier, changed. There always was a code of conduct for war, and supposedly combatants fought combatants and did not intentionally target civilians. In the last 30 years, there are more civilians killed as collateral, not as collateral damage, but because they were targeted, than throughout all of history combined. So there's just a whole lot that I think is so important if you ever work in global health, that is really our responsibility to understand what is the history here. And we can just go and do important and good things, but it means so much more if you put it in context of the place that you're working and the larger place like the globe and how this has all worked. But interestingly enough, some things don't change. These are just women at the wells, and I brought this in here because everywhere, even in the most dire circumstances, people gather at the wells, women do. And you can even find, albeit an arguable statement, somebody was just telling me about how important it was for the socialization of the village that they worked in, that women had to go, and you see those big jerry cans there, those are 5-gallon things, and sometimes it's kids who are carrying them. I mean, they're terribly heavy, and it's really hard work. But this is socialization for the women, and it's about the only time that they have legitimately to move away from the household chores and go to the wells, and they do that. And in certain places where water has been pumped in and pipes have been pumped in, when it broke down, it didn't get repaired because they went back to the wells, and it was their way of being able to socialize. Water is a hugely important thing. This is a cholera tent, and most of the people in this photo did not survive. Again, as they're walking to the refugee camps, they're drinking out of the wells, and often the people who are trying to help them cannot get out to the wells because there's mines that are seeded throughout this was in Cambodia, and that was the case there. And so by the time they get to the camp and an IV can be started and help can be given, they're just too far gone. And cholera epidemics still seem to run rampant, especially when there's a large number of people amassed. Marasmus, you've seen, you know, when you pick up the skin and it doesn't go back down. Old people have that. Or kwashiorkor, which is the protein deficiency. This is still quite rampant in many places around the globe, and it's a very difficult thing to treat. In a few minutes, there's one that I'm going to show you and how they do treat it. But we have moved somehow from Africa to the Balkans. And these are in here just to show you that for many of these people, before they have to flee, they are living in very beautiful places, very serene places, until war hits. And I'm just going to run through a couple in these Balkans to sort of jump from Africa and Asia to a wholly different context. Imploded houses. This happened to be in an area of Bosnia, even though it was a three-way war. The Serbs would come in, and most of these were houses heated by gas. So they would, if the people had been forced out, they would go into the home so they could never return, and they would walk in, turn on the gas, and then come back outside and lob a Molotov cocktail, and the roofs would fall off. And then they would, in some instances, add insult to injury and mark their names onto the buildings and the houses. In both Bosnia and in Kosovo, there was massive migration. It happened over a much longer period of time in Bosnia than it did in Kosovo, but it did continue for 4 years in Bosnia and actually only 6 months in Kosovo. Nevertheless, there were, in a matter of 6 months, an awful lot of things that happened. This was a massacre that occurred in a village in southwest Kosovo in April of '99, and they came to this village and they killed 84 men and boys. The UN came in, gathered the bodies because they wanted to use this as an international war crimes case and to try and hold the people accountable in The Hague. These pictures were taken in August of '99. They returned the remains, and these are the caskets and the graves where they'll be buried, and a lot of people from other villages that are coming to pay their respects. And we're going to fly somewhere else now, back to Angola. I put these in just because some things don't change, and the way you weigh kids to figure out if they are going to need therapeutic feedings. You can do it under a shade tree. You can do it in wherever, and they love it because they swing on these things, and it's just great fun for them. The one on the left was probably taken 30 years ago. The one on the right was taken about 2002 or 4. And this is one of the primary things, if some of you ever want to come in, you might have seen them. This is a MUAC bracelet, a middle upper arm circumference, and it's how you measure whether a child needs to go into a therapeutic feeding center, which means that he or she's going to have to be fed every 2 hours, tiny, tiny kinds of things, because that baby, this baby, that baby that had the big belly, they will die if you feed them too fast, but that's also true. But when you pull this around the upper arm, like here, you can see whether they're in a red zone, an orange zone, whatever. And some of these babies, I don't know if you can see that far, but their upper arm circumference is not as big as some of your thumbs, actually. And it takes an enormous amount of effort to get them to survive. And it isn't just the people, it's the animals as well that are killed. And that means not only the people who have, my experience is that they have a real affinity and a relationship with their animals, so there's an emotional grief that comes, but there's also the reality that it's another source gone forever, and they're not going to have anybody if they can, or any animal to help them do their fields if they get back. So what do you do? Where do you start? You know a lot about what you're doing before you go, or you try to. You have to do assessments. It may not be you doing it, but whatever organization you're going to work with will do a really, really good assessment and be skilled in knowing how to prioritize needs, because you can't take care of everything, and then start moving in to address those needs in collaboration with other organizations, in collaboration with national partners, community partners. Hopefully, and I'm sure you all hear a lot about the importance of cultural competency. I don't know that any of us ever get culturally competent, even in our own culture, let alone somebody else's. But if you're ever aware of the importance of culture and how communication with people can impact your success or your failure, believe me, it is extraordinarily important. And we have a lot of really skilled people, but they go on the spectrum from being culturally incompetent all the way to culturally competent and everything in between. Engaging local people as much as you possibly can in their own recovery, helping them be part of planning for their future, not top-down parachuting kinds of approaches, which sometimes we do from the Western world. And always, always, no matter how dire a situation, there are strengths, and you play to the strengths. And I'm going to show you a couple of pictures, and I'm in some of these pictures because I want to just prove that you walk your talk. You cannot do anything unless you engage the local people. These are Sri Lankan professionals being taught how to deal with certain kinds of respiratory issues that came from people swallowing mud, but they're also being taught how to deal with trauma to help those guys that were pulling the bodies in. So it's a twofold thing. There's never enough resources, and when you're training, sometimes you've got to train people to do clinical skills, but you also have to help them to understand how to deal with trauma. This is in Angola, the place where you saw those little boys. These are all chieftains. This is a guy who's got a headdress on because the Cape buffalo is their their revered sacred animal. Each one of these was a chief in a village that was overrun, and they all had to flee and bring their villages into these refugee camps. We could not go into those refugee camps without these guys' permission. So you sit and you talk to these people as long as it takes for them to understand what your motive is, and for them to understand what their responsibility is, what our responsibility is, and then you move. And I might say sometimes it's a challenge. At least two of these guys were really drunk. They were, but we made it work anyway. These are the physicians who worked with the village in Kosovo. And these all were really fine guys who'd lived through hell themselves. But it never had occurred to them that it was their responsibility to go out into the villages, because in many places in the world, educated people don't see it as their role or their responsibility to have to go out, especially dealing with peasants or whomever. And so it was really a breakthrough to spend time with these guys and to have them realize not only could they do it, they began to want to do it. And they went out to those villages and made a huge difference. And this is jumping into the Darfur camps. These were the marabouts. The other fellow who looks European he's a Swedish surgeon, and he and I were supposed to be doing this evaluation of the project there, and the first thing we had to do, just like with the other chieftains, these are the traditional healers. The lady in purple has a specialty of dealing with scorpion stings. They each have a very major role, and if you try to jump them and not include them in what you're doing, you lose. And then you come home. And one of the things that you do when you come home is exactly what I'm doing right now. And I never know, and I think most of us who try to do this never know quite the best way to speak for those people that can't ever come home with us. But you try to do it, and some people do it in very big ways and testify to the UN. A lot of my colleagues in the New York office of MSF have done that. But one of the most memorable things for me when MSF, or Doctors Without Borders, received the Nobel Peace Prize was a statement. We don't know that words can save lives, but we absolutely do know that silence can kill. And that is the other part of what it means to, I think, be working in global health, at least from the standpoint of a humanitarian perspective, is that you do need to find a way to give a face and a place to those people who can't do it for themselves. And then you come home. And you also realize that this has been going on forever. And so it weighs really heavy, but the sun always comes up and the sun always goes down, and there's always extraordinary people who are in these places helping their own people. And they are quite memorable, and they are really pretty special to be able to share with you. So that is what I have to say. Thank you. Thank you. So has anybody got any comments or thoughts or questions? I think that maybe there's time for just a couple if anybody has any, and if you don't, that's okay too. It's pretty heavy stuff. Yes, sir.
Why do the locals not want those Japanese trees?
Oh, thank you. Okay, why, you want to take a guess? Why would they not?
I really don't know, but maybe they don't want it to look better, the environment to look
Yeah. They, remember, are resettled out of their own country into a foreign country, even though it's over a border. So when those trees, even though they would have, I mean, who knows if cherry trees are going to survive in the sub-Saharan place, but the Japanese brought in a lot and planted them, and they didn't want them there because it was a symbol of permanency, and they want to go home. They want to go home. And my question when I was there, and my concern was, so what do? They're very, very respectful of their elderly, as you saw my sweet and wonderful 84-year-old there. But, you know, some of them don't survive. And so what happens when people die, they're not going to be able to take them home. And I think that's going to create another huge valley of grief for these people when they have to leave their deceased ones. But they absolutely did not want those cherry trees. Okay. Oh, I'm glad y'all remembered about the cherry trees. That would have been, well, a lot of people, well, no, a lot of people would say that also happened in the tsunami, that there was such a flood of people coming to help in this crisis. It was a circus, and that is true. Unfortunately, humanitarian aid has become a business. And while there are legions of extraordinary people who literally give their lives in the best of it, for the best of reasons and the most pure reasons, there's an awful lot of grappling for the same dollars, the same donors, to have a place and a space to say that you're doing whatever you're doing. They don't share information, and it's not unlike a lot of other arenas that we work in. However, there is a book I would suggest to you. How many of you have ever heard of Toxic Charity? Has anybody heard of that book? Well, there is a book out now that addresses this very thing and talks about how our attempt to render aid is backfiring, and that it is toxic and it's creating problems for the people we intend to help. I agree with that. I absolutely agree with that. And I think that we all who do this kind of stuff have got to take a real step back and look critically. That said, there are people that I just showed you that I know are alive because organizations go. So I don't know what the answer is, because these people look at you and say, from the depths of their being, thank you for saving my child. So I don't know that we're going to know the answer anytime soon. I do think that we all need to be much more, we need to think much more critically about the best approach, and we are moving into a new era, because what happened in the 90s, there was so much money, there was a plethora of organizations that started up, faith-based and non-faith-based, both. And then there are these things, you know, you don't hear about them much. I'm on film, aren't I? I'll go ahead and say it. But the gongos. And you think, what is a gongo? So an NGO is a non-government organization. Then you got a GO, but then you've got government-owned non-government organizations. So you have, you know, USAID and PEPFAR or CDC and different entities that sometimes, you know, have a way of springing up their own, and even universities do it to a degree now. So there's some pluses to it, but there's also, it's hard to put your finger on who's doing what and where's the money going. There's a recognition. There's a recognition at WHO, there's a recognition among, like in the United States, there's an organization called Interaction. And it's all of the NGOs and different groups, and they come together and they try and work out how to address this issue. Now, that said, that group was also convened, or at least some of the agencies, when we knew we were going into Iraq. And there was a discussion about whether, how we would deal with the humanitarian crisis. And for a lot of other organizations, that was just not okay. And they felt like, you know, we really were getting that humanitarian space smaller and smaller and smaller by the government asking ahead of time how we're going to deal with the humanitarian crisis. And I know that doesn't sound serious to a lot of people, but it is a serious kind of if you can just do some research before there's a disaster and figure out which organization, or plural organizations, really fit best with your philosophy, your goal. Check out what their spending is, how much goes directly to service, how much is used for overhead and administrative fees, how much do they spend on fundraising versus program services. You'll have a real sense of which organizations you feel comfortable with, and that will help a lot, because most of the big ones are always going to respond to a big disaster, and it really will sort of narrow the. It's like, you know, I have lots of students who say, I really want to get involved in global health. Where do I start? Well, I know it doesn't sound like anything anybody's interested in, but the place to start is in your backyard. And it's really kind of, it's kind of important if you're going to understand what a crisis is and what is it that you really want to do. And you know, I worked a lot of disasters in Nashville, Tennessee, and I worked a lot of disasters here in the U.S. before I was overseas. Now, that doesn't mean everybody has to do that, but it made me more marketable because I had done that, and I think that's true. And that was my other question I was going to do at the lead-in, and I forgot. When we talk about global health, I think the WHO definition of health is one of those things that is so important when you think about working with the populations like we've talked about this evening. And that piece in that definition that says it is not merely the absence of disease. Health is really a much broader thing than just not being sick. And I think the term well-being really is at the heart of what I like to support, that people who are sort of holistic. Now, in certain circumstances, the needs are so great that you just have to go in and deal with the cholera or the measles epidemic or whatever, and you can't get into all this holistic stuff. There's something called mission creep, too, that can backfire. But generally speaking, if you're going to look over time and have a sustainable program, you're going to have to figure out what people need where they live, not what your program has to provide, and figure out the piece of it. And the other thing that I wanted to, and I guess we really need to close, but the term crisis is a great place to end, because we're talking about global crises. In China, or in Chinese, the word crisis is written with 2 characters. One translates to danger, the other translates to opportunity. And that's where, you know, I will leave you all, is to recognize that even in the face of extraordinary human tragedy, and there's a lot of it, you always realize, I think, that there is an opportunity to help people get through that tragedy and move on. It doesn't mean that you can undo death. It doesn't mean you can undo trauma. You cannot undo that somebody's been tortured. You can't undo any of those things. But if they're fortunate enough to survive, what you try to do is work with them to help them recognize their strengths in getting through it. And in doing so, they have a really special place on this planet, and that they can go on, and as much as possible, you'll go on with them. And that's really quite something to leave people. So again, I thank you so much for this invitation. It's been a pleasure to be with you.